Hello, my Lynn Things family and friends. Welcome on back to the channel, guys. You know what today is. It is Saturday. So what does that mean? It is story time with Lynn. And remember, we are reading from the amazing book As I Am, the story about Cicely Tyson. And remember, we're not reading every page or all of it because, again, it's not, my story, but it's her story, and I want to, not give away all of it because we do still want people to purchase the book if they so desire. I just wanted to share some of the pages and some of the passages that just really touched my heart, although the whole book touched my heart. But, we're just reading parts of the book. So this is part 4, and we are on chapters 6 and 7. So guys, get yourselves all settled in. Like I say, if this is your time to, this is your me time, this is your quiet time, this is your cleaning up time, whatever time it may be, go ahead and get comfortable, and just play me in the background. If, just kind of like listening to an audiobook or something like that. You can have me playing in the background, or you can watch. I will be reading, but we got to get all nice and comfy. So our candle of the evening is going to be my personal candle, guys, from my birthday kit. And so we know this is a lavender scent. Yes, y'all. So we're going to be lighting our little candle, and maybe if you want to get all nice and cozy and like to light a candle as well, please go ahead, feel free to do so. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure I sat it down in a safe space. So now we're going to have our ambiance and our quiet, and we're going to get into our reading. If this is your first time visiting this channel, my name is Lynn, and I usually am doing Dollar Tree hauls or reviews. I like showing my done, doing decor with done and Dollar Tree items, and like I said, reviews on the things that I purchased from the Dollar Tree. So that's what you'll probably mainly see on this channel. This is a new segment that I have added to my channel called Storytime with Lynn. I read this book, and I'm just in awe of this wonderful woman, and I really wanted to share her story. And so I started this Storytime with Lynn Saturdays at 6 p.m. So of course you can watch it whenever you're ready to watch it. I thank you guys for coming back. I'm glad that you are finding this interesting. It has really been amazing. So I'm going to jump into the reading because I do know it does take some time to read. I'm trying to do 2 chapters a video, and they kind of run long. So go ahead and get comfortable, get yourself a drink, like I say, light you a candle, whatever you may do. And however, we're going to get to reading now, guys. So chapter 6, it is titled Unspoken. Parents lie to their children. They misrepresent their painful truths and their personal histories. Concealing is the human way of pretending that we are who we imagine ourselves to be in the fairy tales we invent. That our lives have unfolded as we wish they would have, rather than as they so wrenchingly did. My mother's falsehoods were not outright fabrication, but lies of omission. She spoke little and withheld much, a restraint every bit as damaging as a bare-faced falsehood. Her silence cost us both. My first menstrual period arrived the same way most things did in the Tyson household, without much mention. It also arrived quite early. When I was just 9 years old. In those years, Mom had her way of keeping us entertained when school and the sun were both out. On summer weekends, she'd often take us on the L from our place to the east side, all the way down to Battery Park. I lived for those rides. Okay, guys, I just wanted to make sure I'm staying on point. So it says, I poked my head out of the train window to watch the world whiz by, savoring the breeze on my cheeks, gazing into the high-rise windows, and wondering about the families I spotted. Parks, museums, and zoos. Mom shuttled us all over the city and the tri-state area. One Sunday afternoon, the 4 of us even enjoyed an annual boat excursion organized by our church at Kingsburg Beach in New Jersey. Early the next morning, Mom awakened me. She says, go to the bathroom and wipe yourself. I sleepily rubbed my eyes as she held up a square cotton rag and 2 long strings, each with a large safety pin attached to its end. Put this on, she said. Where? I asked. She motioned for me to tie the strings around my waist and pin them onto the rag. Moments later in the bathroom, when I stared down at my scarlet soaked underpants, I was sure I was dying. I don't know how Mom even knew I started my menstrual. She probably dreamed about it or sensed it. I'd once overheard my sister mention something about menstruation, and though I was older than Emily and should have known more than she, I wasn't at all clear what was all involved. Nowadays, I cringe and I shake my head in disbelief when I recall just how ill-informed I was. A few years later, my breasts joined the puberty party. The budding chest I'd had at 9 was in full bloom by my 12th birthday. That year, Mom had moved us from our place on 98th to 178th East 101st Street into a two-bedroom railroad apartment near my school, Margaret Knox Junior High. One afternoon, I was playing out in front of our building, practicing on the piano, and I saw my father approaching from down the street. So I sprinted up that hill to meet him, and as I ran, my chest bounced up and down, jiggling and screaming for support. After Dad and I embraced, he turned to me with a serious expression and said, "Go upstairs and tell your mom I said to put on a bra on you." I stared at him and then down at my sandals, mortified that Dad had noticed that my boobs needed harnessing. I didn't mention his observation to Mom, but he must have said something to her because soon after she arrived home from Alexander's holding an acknowledgement of my adolescence. "Put this on," is all she said, and she handed me a B-cup corset. I don't know why my mother hadn't purchased a bra for me before then, or whether she planned to talk to me about this mysterious corridor I had entered. My guess is she was too embarrassed to speak about it. Also, discussing my changing body would have meant reckoning with the inevitable. Her firstborn girl, the once sickly child she'd for so long kept close, had grown out of her arms and into a new season. Dating came late in our house, and it's a miracle that it arrived at all. My mother was wary of strangers. Only family could be trusted, she reasoned. If anything ever happens to me, she'd often say in the years after she and my father split, I know I can rely on those two men to look after my children. The men she referred to were a couple of my father's cousins, whom he'd grown up with in Nevis. I was around 14 when my mother discovered her faith had been grievously misplaced. One evening when brimstone spilled over between Mom and me about God knows what, I blurted out a secret I had been too fearful up to then to expose. One of those men had put his hands on me when I was 11. During a moment when Mom had turned her attention towards supper, he'd brushed his palm along my backside of my dress, robbing me of a sense of safety that I had once had. Upon hearing my revelation, Mom hadn't picked up her jaw before Emily exclaimed, "And me too." Until then, I hadn't known my sister had been touched. As outgoing as Emily was, she and I shared remarkably little about our interior worlds in those years, adopting the same code of silence our mother lived by. Mom's eyes filled with horror, and she disappeared into her bedroom. She never mentioned our disclosure. I often wonder whether she privately confronted that cousin, because after that day, we rarely saw him. From then on, she became so adamant about protecting us that she wouldn't even entertain male friends. She couldn't take the chance that another man would mess with her girls. When Emily and I each turned 15, Mom last allowed us to begin socializing with young men. She didn't refer to it as dating. She also didn't reconcile her previous insistence that I stay away from boys with her consent for me now to keep company with them. She had her reasons for kind of loosening up the reins. Her dream for Emily and me was that we'd one day meet and marry nice church boys. a desire made clear by her parameters. My mother's first commandment: thou shalt go out only with a young man who is the son of a minister. All other socializing had to be with family members that she'd vetted. The Doris family and their four teenage boys, cousins on my mom's side, were on the approved list. Horace Chenery was one of my first crushes. He was a year older than me and as tall as heaven. With kind eyes, he lived a few doors down from us on the same street and attended my school. Horace didn't go to church, strike one, two, and three in Mom's book, but Horace's mom, Miss Violet, was an usher in our congregation. Violet's mom, Miss Lawrence, was half white and half black, and she'd passed her honey complexion on to her grandchildren. Though Miss Violet was my color, Horace was quite fair, with a dreamy smile and dimples. On the day when Horace and I caught each other's eye in our neighborhood, I blushed and quickly looked away. It wasn't just Horace's appearance that gave me goose pimples. As we got to know one another on those long walks home from school, I felt drawn to him because of how he made me see myself, through the soft light of his adoring lens. You know, he'd often tell me as we walked from school, "Your face is shaped like a heart." He'd then gently trace his thumbs around my face as I snickered. I couldn't get home fast enough to study my reflection in the bathroom mirror. Could I be cute? I thought. I also fell for his brilliance. In those years, I was an admirer of the mind. This is true even now. If you can tell me something that I don't know, then you got me. One afternoon, Melrose saw Horace and me walking down our street together. I realized he'd noticed us but not thought nothing of it. That changed when later that evening Mom approached me with a sentence I knew meant trouble. "Come here, I want to talk to you," she says. I took a place at our kitchen table and I sat down across from her. "Now this Horace Chenery business," she says, "it has to stop. I don't want you seeing him anymore." "I'm not seeing him," I retorted. "What do you mean?" Right then, my brother rolled into the kitchen with his public service announcement. "You and Horace was on 101st Street together today," he says. I glared at Melrose, not sure why he'd ratted me out to Mom, perhaps out of some annoying instinct to shelter me the way my parents always had. "Well, I lived on 101st Street, and so does he," I said. "Where else was I supposed to walk?" "You're supposed to walk any place but next to him," says her mother. "I don't ever want to see you talking to that boy again." Horace may not have been a minister's son, but he was an upstanding young man, which, as I saw it, should have earned him boyfriend clearance. Mom saw it differently, and in a house more dictatorship than democracy, I knew not to question her mandate. Also, giving her lip would have led to further restriction on my social agenda. I spotted Horace from my window the next day, just as he swung around the corner onto our block. Mom was at work, and Emily and Melrose were not around, but my neighbor, Elizabeth, was visiting me. When Horace got close to my building, he looked up and he waved at us. Elizabeth, who didn't know Horace and I were sweet on one another, waved back at him and grinned. "You know him?" I asked her. "No," she says, "but I've seen him around here and he is cute." That's when I got an idea. I called out to Horace, shouting for him to wait. Elizabeth and I dashed down the stairs and met him in front of the apartment. Out of breath, I scanned our surroundings to be sure Tattletale Melrose and Mom were nowhere in sight. I then turned toward Horace. "I have something to tell you," I said. "What is it?" he asked. "My mother and my brother don't want to see me and you together anymore," I said, hardly pausing between each word. He frowned. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I can't really explain it," I told him. "I just can't see you anymore, okay?" I stared at the ground and then looked up at Elizabeth. "But I want to introduce you to my friend," I said to Horace. "She's really nice and you'll like her." For a long moment, none of us said anything as the awkwardness of the situation hung in the air. Horace, befuddled yet clear that there was no more information to be gathered from me, finally spoke. "Well, look," he said to me, "this has nothing to do with us." Then, as the perfect gentleman he was, Horace warmly greeted Elizabeth. I'm sure she had been standing there wondering what the devil she'd walked into. That was the summer of 1939. Horace and Elizabeth dated throughout high school and eventually married and raised a family together. Both of them, my maiden crush and my neighbor, are long gone now. All of these years later, I'm left with questions, with specks of wistfulness and regret in the spaces between them. How might my life have turned out if I'd stayed with the beau who'd stolen my heart, even as he traced it with its shape with his thumbs? What if, rather than my friend had been the one to marry Horace? What would have happened if I defied my mother and secretly followed my inclination? I can only ponder. I may not have had much of a voice during my adolescence, but I did have aspirations. Given my talent for the piano and organ, I initially thought I'd become a concert musician, a dream my mother birthed on my behalf. My goals shifted the year I was 15. By then, I was taking lessons from a lady by the name of Miss Mann. Her eldest son was the organist at Covenant Avenue Baptist Church in Harlem, and sometimes I'd accompany the choir or play for the congregation there. During a concert one Sunday, I played from memory, Poet and Peasant, a 15-page overture composed by Franz von Suppe. At the close of the piece, when I stood and I bowed at the warm applause, I said to myself, I will never do this again. Sure enough, on that afternoon, I walked away from the piano, and it was on the last day I set my fingers on ivory. Not only had Franz's piece worn me out, the piano demanded far too much time. I'd wake up early to rehearse for 2 hours before school, only to return to that hard bench before bed. All that money wasted, my mother fussed. In hindsight, I'm stunned she let me quit. However insistent I was, Mom continued in her mission to rear us with some culture. And by then, I felt I'd soaked up my share. By age 16, I had moved on to hairdressing. For years, Mom had had her hair pressed by a woman who lived 2 blocks up, Miss Jones. How on earth can I remember these names? No wonder I have a headache. So many details are in my head, comma. After Miss Jones paused, her hot comb got handed down to me. I was good enough at pressing and curling that I turned it into a little business, a way to earn my own money in a house where cash was scarce. On Friday nights, I'd pack my bag with that hot comb and bobby pins and curling irons and begin making my way around to all the homes of the sisters in the church. My road show continued on Saturdays. Then on Sundays, I'd peer out across the sanctuary to see my handiwork on display in pew after pew of fresh pressed pin curls. Horace had convinced me I was cute, and my hot comb contributed to my vanity. I stayed in the bathroom mirror, running between there and the stove as I laid down my edges and pressed out my bangs. All that primping made me constantly late for class, because no way was I showing up in school with my hair all over the place. I had a different style for every day of the week, from deep waves on Monday to a chignon on Friday. I pressed the life out of my strands every morning, restoring them to order after I'd slept them into a mess the night before. Once when I rolled into French class, tardy as usual, my teacher, Miss Bynes, lifted an eyebrow. "Cicely, why can't you get up here on time?" she asked. I pointed to my hair. "Well," she said, smirking, "one day that hair is going to put you on the top of the world." Neither of us could have known just how right she was. Emily also earned her own money. Having inherited our mother's skill as a seamstress, she had landed a job at a lingerie factory, sewing gorgeous and expensive slips, underwear, and bras. That's when our arguing began. I'd sneak into her bureau and pull out one of her lacy camisoles, tie it into a knot so that it would fit me. and wear it beneath my clothes. After school, I'd race home to shove that camisole back into her drawer before Emily could discover it was missing. "Stay out of my things," she would yell. I'd smile and scamper off, with no intention of keeping my hands to myself. That lingerie was far too pretty to just lay there unworn. Melrose worked as well at any job he could hustle up on the streets. For a time, he had a job at a bagel shop, and in the evenings, once his shift was done, he'd come through our apartment carrying fresh baked bagels, with an aroma tantalizing enough to pull us out of our bed for a taste. My father lived close by. I saw him frequently. The year I was 16, my Aunt Zora, Dad's sister, hosted a party with her social lady friends and some family. Dad took me along. The two of us were off in a corner, catching up. He had his back up against a chest of drawers, with his arms loosely draped around me as he stood behind me. "Cicely," he said, "why don't you come over here?" I swivel around and I look up at him. "Dad, why are you talking to me like that?" "Like I'm on the other side of the room," I ask. "Oh, so you think you're the only Cicely in the world?" he says, laughing. He nodded toward a tall, elegant black woman in a far corner. "That's the lady you're named after," he says. As soon as I stepped through our apartment door that evening, I gave Mom the news. "I met my namesake today," I announced. "What kind of foolishness you talking, child?" she says. I told her about my father's confession. "I always knew I wasn't named after no little girl from next door," I told her. "I just had a feeling." Mom stared in my direction, but she didn't speak. "Did you hear me?" I said. "I met the lady I was named after." My mother remained silent, even after she and my dad had separated, even after he'd raised his palm and bruised her spirit. She never spoke negatively of him to us, other than her occasional reminder that Willie Tyson, as she always referred to him, had refused to accompany her to the hospital when I was born. Despite how my dad had hurt my mother, he was still our father, still the man she insisted that we respect. When she did mention my dad's shortcomings, she usually did it indirectly, by folding in his transgressions with all those of his gender who'd been unfaithful. "These men," she'd say in plural, "they no good." When I recounted today's happenings for a third time, Mom leaned back in her rocker and uttered a phrase she used often. "You do well," she said, shaking her head. "You do well." That was her way of saying, "So you finally know something you didn't know, huh? Well, good for you. What you're claiming might be true, but I'll never admit it." It was also her way of urging you past an uncomfortable conversation and back to the land of mute. "You're dismissed," the end. A period and a closed subject. You do well. Go ahead and move on. Kenneth had been on my mother's approved list even before she had seen him. He checked the only box that seemed to matter to her. He was the offspring of a reverend. At the party, when Kenneth had asked whether he could take me out, I'd agreed, knowing in my heart that he wasn't for me. He was respectful and attractive, but in his presence I felt none of that magnetism that had pulled me toward Horace. That much I knew. All else, my mother would decide. Not long after, my personal world was likewise overturned. I don't remember everything about the day that permanently ended my childhood, that finished it off with a painful and lasting punctuation mark. The moments that I do recall, many of them now dim and faded, unfolded in slow motion. It was late spring, toward the end of my junior year in 1942. With Mom's permission, I'd planned to see Kenneth at his apartment around 4 o'clock that afternoon following school. "I want you home by 7, she says. I nodded and I left. This wasn't my first visit to Kenneth's place. Over the months, as he charmed my mother with his impeccable manners, Miss Tyson this and Miss Tyson that, she had been increasingly permissive of our spending time together on our own. I think she was more smitten with Kenneth than I'd ever likely be. in love with the idea of our possible future together. Our evening progressed pleasantly, like many others before. We sat on his living room sofa, talking about the news of the day and listening to the radio. And after we'd been together for a while, I glanced at my watch. 6:20. I gotta go, I said, imagining the heck that I would catch if I had returned home even 1 minute late. I pulled on my jacket and I walked to the door, and he followed me. Why you gotta leave so soon, he says playfully, resting his hand on mine. You should stay a little longer. He turned me around and pulled me toward him, my back resting against the door, and he slowly unbuttoned my coat and then gently began kissing me. Before I knew it, our caressing grew more intense and he lifted my dress. I recoiled slightly, but before I could back away, he was inside me. He immediately exploded. With my thighs trembling, I look at my watch again. It is 6:40. I really do have to go, I say, straightening my dress and rebuttoning my coat. As I grappled internally with what had just occurred, he and I said nothing, and I left. On the bus ride home, I replayed the scene in my head over and over. Did we just have intercourse? Is that what that was? I honestly was not sure. Like my period and all other topics of a sensitive nature, Mom had never had a forthright conversation with me about intercourse. Nature had a different take, though. A few weeks later, when my period went missing, Mom, fearing the likely but praying for the improbable, booked a doctor's appointment. After I had been examined and given a pregnancy test, the doctor pulled my mother aside in the hallway. Your daughter is pregnant, I heard him tell her through the half-open door. She's probably almost a month along. Mom was silent. In the exam room, my heart hammered away in my chest as my brain raced. Pregnant? How could I be pregnant? Kenneth and I didn't do anything for me to get pregnant. We didn't even lay down. Mom returned to the room and stared at me, aware by my stone face that I had overheard what the doctor said. A tear escaped down her cheek. If only you'd waited, she whispered, her voice trembling. And now, dear God, Willie Tyson is going to kill me for this child. After Mom and Dad had separated, my father had often said to her, if anything bad ever happens to my sis, I'll kill you. My circumstance and the view of my religiously raised parents indeed qualified as something bad. Their 17-year-old daughter, herself still a child in many ways, was going to become an unwed mother. I sat there numb in the cold exam room, vulnerable in my thin blue paper gown and sock feet. I could not comprehend what I had just been told. Just as Kenneth hadn't been able to process that our country was under attack, I heard the doctor, and yet the reality of what he'd said felt inconceivable to me, entirely surreal, as if he was talking to some other girl in some other life. While I simply listened in, I dressed as Mom waited in the lobby, sitting side by side on train number 6, going home. Neither one of us spoke. And now that is all of chapter 6. We're going to be going into chapter 7, so if you need to take a break right now, go ahead and take a few minutes and we'll come right back and start chapter 7. Okay guys, welcome back. So the title of chapter 7 is Ground Shifts. Okay. Near the close of my senior year, the principal called me to her office. What is this? She asked, holding up a folded paper. I instantly recognized it as an invitation to my daughter's christening and wondered how she had gotten hold of it. I shrugged. So is it true, she pressed? Do you have a child, Cicely? Seeing no end around the evidence, I nodded. Yeah, I whispered. It's true. She lowered the invitation and sighed. Well, then, I'm sorry, she said, but we cannot allow you to graduate from this school. I stood there staring blankly at her, hoping she'd amend her ruling with an exception. But her judgment was final. Only 4 weeks before I was to receive my diploma, just one measly month before graduation. The secret I had carried beneath my dress had now somehow made its way onto my principal's desk. And as a result, she and the school administration staff disregarded my whole senior year and made me repeat the coursework at the school's night program. The year before, when I first learned that I was expecting, the resulting torrent of emotion nearly took me under. I was confounded about how I'd ever even gotten into such a predicament and fearful about the path forward. Yet, amid the confusion about how I'd become pregnant, amid the immense sadness I felt about how I'd let myself and my parents down, there emerged in me an unimaginable resolve. An unmitigated resolve. I would earn my diploma. That was, for me, as much a matter of practicality as it was of honor. I wanted to complete my course and stand proud at the finish line. If I had to keep my belly under cover in order to march across that graduation stage, I was determined to do so. The concealment turned out to be effortless. I had no discernible baby bump at the start of my senior year, nor did I ever develop a large stomach. Before pregnancy, I'd been a stick, and at 5'4" and around 97 pounds, 6 months into gestation, my belly had grown only to the size of a small cantaloupe, one mostly unnoticeable beneath my clothes. My principal and teachers had no idea I was pregnant, nor did my classmates. My own mother could hardly tell. "That baby must be standing up inside of you," she'd often say. I wore the same A-line button-down dress to school that fall as I wore to the hospital on the day I gave birth the following February. If Emily and Melrose noticed I was pregnant early on, they didn't mention it, and frankly, I did not want to talk about it, did not want to acknowledge my shame aloud. Even once they eventually overheard the news from our mother, my sister and brother, and I never discussed it. Their sorrowful gazes from my eyes to my stomach and back to my eyes said plenty enough. When you get pregnant during adolescence, you grow up in the space of 2 minutes. In 1 minute, your feet are dangling from an exam table as you hold your breath and wait. In minute 2, all wondering is replaced with reckoning, all equivocating with the definitiveness of the doctor's words. And in that instant, you are no longer a girl, wandering and curious and innocent. You are, by proof of a urine sample and by declaration of a physician, ushered to a doorway labeled parenthood. Through that entrance is an uncertain future, filled with an adult anxieties and responsibilities. All at once, your center of gravity shifts from me to us. Your existence is no longer just about you, but rather about the defenseless child who will rely on your strength as a source for his or her own. That is the state I found myself in on the day of my appointment, half clothed and glassy-eyed, seated at the corner of life, as I had known it, and a frightening forever. There was no question that I would keep the child. In my family and church community, abortion was not even a thought or a conversation. With that consideration off the table, I moved right along to the next, whether Kenneth and I would marry. In many ways, that question has also already been answered, because Mom had long since decided that Kenneth was the one for me. The fact that he and I now had a child on the way simply accelerated that eventuality. Just as my mother had pressed for me to go out with Kenneth, she likewise demanded we marry that December. "I'm not signing any papers for you to marry before you're grown," she murmured. "We'll wait until you're 18. When Maya first told her mom she was expecting, her mother asked her calmly, "Do you love the boy? And does he love you?" Maya answered no, and her mother said, "Then there's no sense in ruining 3 lives." The Maya we're speaking of is Maya Angelou, guys, okay? If only things had gone that way in the Tyson household. At the same time, I experienced my mom's insistence that I marry Kenneth as an extension of her autocracy, her maintenance of a control she felt slipping away. Looking back on it, however, I recognize her behavior for what I believe it was. It was an attempt to redeem herself, as well as to redirect the plot line of our family's generational narrative. "No unmarried daughter of mine is going to bring a child here," my mother said to me repeatedly, and yet her mother, Mary Jane, had done exactly that. She and my grandfather Charles were not married when they became intimate, and by the time Mary Jane discovered she was pregnant, Charles had been killed at sea, his fishing boat overturned by a violent storm at Nevis. Years later, a world away, my parents, of course, traded vows, and I had always assumed that they had done so long before welcoming Melrose. Emily, who sat down one day and did the math, eventually steered me to the truth. My dad and mom married after conceiving my brother. And then, to my mother's heartbreak, her daughter had unknowingly repeated the very family pattern she'd longed to end. I think now that my mom pressured me to marry, not just to spare me public disgrace, but as a penance for her own and her mother's choices. Her adamance was a kind of peace offering, a way to restore her purity in the eyes of a heavenly Father she had felt she had disappointed. My first trimester was excruciating. I did not suffer from morning sickness, yet I could not escape a burgeoning sense of remorse. My mother had her way of deepening my regret. Whenever we passed a department store window, she'd repeat the refrain she'd first spoken in the doctor's office. "If only you'd waited, sis," she'd say, shaking her head as she eyed the ornate white gowns. "If you'd have just waited. If only you told me the truth," is what I was thinking. For years, Mom had dreamed of hosting a big wedding for Emily and me. Yet, she'd been so consumed with the notion of a day, of an elaborate one-time affair, that she had neglected to explain the basic facts of life. My 18th birthday arrived on December 19th, just after Christmas, and just before the start of my last school term. Kenneth and I took our places at the altar for a small ceremony in our church. His father officiated. My own father did not attend. I learned later that Mom hadn't invited him. And if I'm honest, I was kind of relieved he wasn't there, thankful to escape his mournful gaze. From the pews, a small group of our family members looked on and wept throughout the service. Everyone cried, tears of lament disguised as those of happiness. It felt more like a funeral than a wedding. As I stood there at the altar in my pale blue gown, my pregnant belly still hardly perceptible, I cried, because I did not want to be married. It didn't matter that Kenneth loved me. It didn't matter that he was a respectable young man, which he was. He had not shirked his responsibility to me, to us, to our unborn child. He'd even welcomed the nuptials. And yet, despite how he might have felt or behaved, plain and clear, I was not ready for the commitment. Repeating my vows felt like surrendering my freedom, just as I was beginning to find out who I was. This marriage placed a chokehold on the discovery. With the exchange of our gold bands and the declaration by the Reverend, I was no longer Cicely. I had become a wife, an underling to be commanded and shepherded. The day after the wedding, I moved out of my mother's apartment and into Kenneth's place. Though I relocated, I never truly left Mom's house. Kenneth worked at night and as a security guard. Since I was so close to delivering, my mother insisted that I stay with her in the evenings. She wanted to keep close watch over me, just as she had been doing since the day I was born. One day in February, after arriving at Mom's apartment, I felt unusually energetic. Powered by my burst of vigor, I had cleaned the apartment from stem to stern, pulling down the drapes and pulling off the sheets, throwing everything in the bathtub so I could scrub it clean on the washboard. By the time my mother arrived from work, I was wiped out. "I think I'll go home now," I told her. "Kenneth is off tonight." "No," she says, "you can't go home now," she said, glancing at the clock. "It's after 9. It's too late for you to be out in the streets. You should just stay here." Practically before she could complete the sentence, I was laid out on her bed. A couple of hours later, I got up to use the bathroom. When I lumbered back to bed and groaned, Mom awakened. "What's the matter with you?" she says. "Well, I gotta pee," I told her, "but I can't seem to go." She sat up. "Put on your clothes right now," she says. My sudden urge to clean and to nest, along with the inability to urinate, told her that my labor was imminent. "For what?" I asked. "I said put on your clothes," she snapped. I did as I was instructed, and moments later we were out on a steep stretch of Lexington Avenue. trying to hail a taxi in snow that felt like it was up to our waists. On the icy uphill sidewalk, my mother slipped. There I was with my pregnant belly and my freezing palms struggling to pull her up off the ground. Once I did, we still could not find a cab. In the pitch black, we walked for the longest time before finally finding a ride to Metropolitan Hospital. We walked through those doors at 4 a.m. Thus began the wait. Hour after hour, nurses paraded in and out of my room, checking to see how much I had dilated. As I lay there, wishing I had stayed home a little while longer. Finally, at 6:30 that evening, when my water broke, doctors began debating the best method of delivery. My birth canal was so tiny they feared that I'd be ruptured when the baby came, so they say, let's cut her. I heard one of them say, that was my cue to faint. I regained consciousness just in time to see them taking my daughter out of me. Even before I saw her face, I heard her. Because, boy, she was already sucking away on that thumb, as I did as a child. As the nurses stitched me up, the doctors laid my 6-pound, 3-ounce angel on my chest. Her body warm, her head as bald as mine once was, her heart pattering in sync with my own. Mom encouraged me to call my daughter Miriam, the name she wanted to give me. I instead gave her a name that I chose. And in these pages, I will call her Joan. Kenneth wanted us to take our daughter home by taxi, but I had refused. Knowing just how little money we had saved, he had been working back-to-back shifts, socking away all that he could for our little family. Yet, even with his diligence, we were barely making rent. 2 weeks after I had given birth, I returned to school. My breast heavy with milk, my resolve to graduate undiminished. By day, I kept my head in a math textbook while Kenneth cared for Joan, until I could race home during my lunch break to nurse her. I then pumped fresh milk to leave for her in the refrigerator. As soon as the last bell of the school day sounded, I was out that door again, eager to get home to my sweetheart as Kenneth prepared to leave for work. I continued that routine for weeks until the afternoon in May when my principal cut short my momentum with her discovery. I hadn't planned to christen my daughter right away. I wanted to wait until summer, after my schooling was complete. But of course, my mother replaced my desire with her mandate. Joan would be dedicated during a service at our church that May. My mother planned the whole ceremony and even mailed out the invitations, one of which landed in the hands of a woman my father had previously had an affair with. That woman's son happened to be a fellow student in my science class. He had been the one to disclose my secret to the principal. On the day that I was summoned to her office, it made no difference that I stood within shouting distance of my diploma. What mattered was the school's strict policy. Students were not permitted to indulge in what they considered adult behavior. I'm sure some of my classmates were sexually active, but the proof was in the pregnancy. And once it was revealed that I was a mother, that revelation immediately revoked my status as a student and made that year's credits null and void. Devastating as this news was, I felt undeterred in my quest to earn my diploma. For me, those months were the most painful of my young motherhood. The night campus was all the way down on 18th Street, an hour's ride away by train. As much as I yearned to move beyond my mother's rule, I was also desperate for her help, especially since Kenneth worked nights. Together, he and I decided that Mom would watch Joan in the evenings while I attended class. In the fall of 1943, when Joan was about 7 months old, our grand rotation commenced. I took a job as a part-time clerk, working from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. While Kenneth cared for our daughter, I'd then hurry home to feed and change her before carrying her off to my mother's apartment, where she'd stay until I returned in the late evening. The moment I walked through the door, Joan would begin wailing for me, her arms outstretched from the edge of her crib. How agonizing it was for me to be away from my baby, to hear her weeping when I returned, to see her little face flooded with tears. It was why I often now tell young people, slow down and think, to use protection, to consider what's involved when you bring a human being into this world. It is a heartbreaking thing for children to have children. These kids, They just go off and have babies and they have no idea of the commitment involved. How their parents will be as irrevocably altered as mine was. Until you are standing in the responsibility of parenting, you cannot truly understand how it shifts your life's terrain. At the close of 1943, I earned my diploma. My precious Joan nearly was a year old, with a head full of thick hair and a laugh that melted me. I had a child I cherished in a life I never planned on, and by God and by perseverance, I had completed high school. As Kenneth and I settled into married life, a road of tedium and regret stretched before me. And when I peered ahead at that path, extending miles into the distance, I felt an enormous urge to retch. The ending of my life story, it seemed, had already been written before I even had a chance to live it. I hadn't even been in love with Kenneth. Our union did nothing to change that. In fact, I had no desire to be married, period. And I'm sure he could feel that. My resentment pervaded our every exchange, spilled over into the long bouts of silence between us. I wanted to do right by our daughter, as well as be respectful of my husband and our vows. And yet, the thought of pretending of living out my mother's dream instead of discovering my own felt utterly soul destroying. When Joan was 2 years old, I left Kenneth. After following the afternoon, I cleared out the apartment. I never saw him again. He, of course, called over to my mother's place looking for me, desperate to know how he could mend whatever was broken between us. I'm sure she must have told him what my actions had been made apparent. Ahead of my departure, I did not tell Kenneth I was leaving the marriage. I knew it would shatter him, and it did. Yet it was a choice I felt strongly I needed to make. And if I had told him, he just would have tried to dissuade me. We did speak by phone after I left, and he pleaded for me to reconsider, begged me to allow him to remain part of our daughter's world. But I was firm in my decision that we separate entirely. Kenneth was a good man, but it wouldn't have done either of us a favor for me to languish in a relationship my spirit could not take. Maya Angelou's mother had it right. I would have ruined 3 lives. Even as I fled, I knew I was trading one metaphorical prison for another. With no place else to go, I had to return back to my mother's apartment. I could not yet stand on my own financial feet, and to Mom's credit, she graciously welcomed me back. But once that short honeymoon wore off, we began clashing. She wanted to do things her way. She wanted to raise Joan as she saw best. And I, newly emboldened by my role as mother and head of my family, resisted her domination. Yet, because I relied on Mom to look after Joan while I worked, there was only so much arguing I could do. That left me seething internally. Our family doctor recognized my rising blood pressure and mounting stress and mentioned it to my father. Cicely's going to have a nervous breakdown if she stays in that house, he told my dad. You need to get her out of there. After I had been with Mom for 2 years, Dad heeded the doctor's warning and moved me in with his sister, my Aunt Zora, in Mount Vernon. Between my aunt and other nearby family, my village rose up to help care for Joan while I pieced together a living for us. On the weekends or any time I could manage to get off work, I took my daughter everywhere with me, wheeling her around in the carriage that I had splurged on. In the newspapers, I had seen images of well-to-do London mothers with their fancy buggies, complete with oversized hoods. Though such strollers became scarce during wartime, I would not rest until I hunted one down, a used one. My determination was not about necessity. It was about gifting my beloved princess with royal treatment, the same sense of nobility and worth that my parents had bestowed upon me. When Joan was around 4 years old, I began work as a legal secretary, a law firm at 551 Fifth Avenue. The following year, when she was old enough for kindergarten, I enrolled her into the Little Brown Schoolhouse, a small private school in the Bronx founded by Helen Meade. I could not truly afford it, but I worked overtime, and I took on side jobs, emptying my financial cupboards in order to cover the cost. I wanted the comfort of knowing that my daughter was in excellent hands, that she had received education superior to my own. Nearly all parents I know can sum up their aspirations for their children in one word: better. That is what my mom and dad wanted for me, Emily, and Melrose when they eked out a life for us in those slums, and it was what I wanted for Joan. It is why I rose before sunup to prepare her for school and walk with her, our fingers all intertwined to the bus stop. It is why I worked steadfastly to keep her in that school. The notion of better was the bedrock of my every choice during Joan's earliest years. From the time she was a baby and into toddlerhood, I treated her like a real life doll, decking her out in little frilly dresses and doting over her as my father had did me. No item was too luxurious for my princess. No bedtime story spared. In the land of make-believe child rearing, the world of pretend parenting, ever on display in the media landscape, dressing Joan up was my way of being the good mom, the ever-present and adoring nurturer. I realize now that it was also my attempting at atoning, of blotting out my past choices with the fresh ink of redemption, just as my own mother has sought to do. Oh wow, God! I hope you guys enjoyed chapters 6 and 7. Whew, that was a lot going on in those two. Again, please let me know down in the comments what piqued your interest, or if you have thoughts on what I read in those last two chapters. Let me know what you think, and like I said, your thoughts on it. Again, thanks so much for joining me in this story time, guys, and I will see you guys next Saturday at 6.